That comes as North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un declared he would hold off on a planned launch of missiles towards Guam. President Trump just tweeting, quote, Kim Jong-un of North Korea made a very wise and well-reasoned decision. The alternative would have been both catastrophic and unacceptable. This coming on the heels of a State Department report claiming the rogue regime tortures and even executes thousands of people for worshiping anyone or anything other than the North Korean government. A somber day ahead in Virginia. Heather Heyer, the woman killed during violent riots last week, will be laid to rest. Heyer was protesting against white supremacists when she was hit by a car that was driven into a crowd. The 32-year-old was a Charlottesville native and worked as a legal assistant. 19 others were hurt in that attack. Former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani is recovering this morning after being rushed to the hospital. Giuliani undergoing emergency surgery on his leg after his knee gave way while on vacation. Giuliani telling the New York Post he suffers from catcher's knee after years of playing baseball. But his wife says he's in good spirits and is already working from his hospital bed. And speaking of baseball, a big salute to all those who fight for our freedoms. The Texas Rangers honoring 100 Purple Heart recipients on the baseball field before the Rangers took on the Detroit Tigers. Dozens of veterans lining up to receive their award as the crowd cheered them on. The Rangers were officially recognized as the first Purple Heart baseball club. Actually, a viewer, Mike, sent me a tweet about that this morning, just saying, did you see this story? And I was like, wow, that is an inspirational and amazing story.
Great stuff.
It really is. Yep. It really is powerful. Thank you, Jillian.
Thanks, Jillian.
All right, if you were watching the channel yesterday, you saw a rollicking, wild press conference in the foyer there at Trump Tower. The president comes out with his Secretary of Transportation and economic advisors as well. The president made a very big mistake yesterday. He thought all of the press pool there would want to talk about infrastructure. He was wrong. They wanted to talk about Charlottesville and in particular why he was so slow to condemn, as he did on Monday, the KKK, the neo-Nazis and white supremacists. He was unapologetic yesterday. He doubled down and talked about how both sides have culpability in what happened in Charlottesville. Watch this.
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious and it was horrible. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is. Excuse me. What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt? What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day. Wait a minute. I'm not finished. I'm not finished, fake news. That was a horrible day. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides. You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
So he's saying, in addition to the activists on both sides, there were people there, he says, who were there because they were not in support of changing the name of the park from Robert E. Lee Park to Emancipation Park and taking down the statues.
Well, I think that's right. I don't think everyone that was part of that on Saturday were evil people. I don't think they came to hurt someone. However, there were a lot of evil people there that were part of hate groups that should be called out. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists that wake up hating certain parts of this country and people every single morning. That should be condemned. That should be called out. And I think people were frustrated, including many members of the Republican Party, that the president didn't seem consistent in his messaging. On Monday, he came out with a very powerful statement. We're talking about uniting this country. We are all in this together. We do not represent this, and calling them out by name. Yesterday, it seemed to go off the rails a bit. It didn't calm the country the way that people were hoping for.
According to Axios, Abby, the president felt in the news coverage over the previous 48 hours that he was beaten up unfairly by the criticism. And so what he did yesterday was he was going to fight back campaign style, which has been very effective for him in the past.
Right. So if you are a fan of that style, and then many people elected him into office because of the way that he does talk and the way that he handles the media. You loved what happened yesterday. If you were on the other side of that, and many folks in the media go to these press conferences trying to find ways to tear him down. That's always going to be the case. But I do feel like there was an opportunity missed here by the president to bring this country together. Anytime there is a situation like this where people feel divided, they feel hurt, you're the commander-in-chief. You have a real responsibility to bring this country together, to unify, but to also just bring some calmness to it.
Well,
right?
I think he did that on Monday, though, when he specified, you know, the KKK, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis. He said these are bigots and they're evil people. Then, on top of that, the president yesterday was talking about, for instance, in this particular event that started it all down there in Charlottesville, and that was the removal of the name of the Robert E. Lee statue and the park as well. The president was wondering, okay, it starts here. Where does this end? There you have a woman who put a strap around, and then that particular statue, I believe in Durham, North Carolina, was toppled. She has been arrested, and now the police there are looking for anybody else who is involved. But in the meantime, the president's wondering, where does this end?
Where does it end? And this is happening across the country. I think we have video of another statue that was torn down last night in Baltimore. You can see it right there. As you mentioned, Steve, the president spoke about this yesterday in this press conference, and he made that very point. He asked the question, where does this end? Here he is.
You take a look at some of the groups and you see, and you know it if you were honest reporters, which in many cases you're not, but many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
And therein lies that question that we keep coming back to. I don't think anybody is going to say that slavery was anything but a horrible, horrible stain on our country. But many of these individuals that began our nation were slaveholders. And is it a slippery slope at this point? Do we start tearing down statues to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so on?
And how do you move on as a country if you don't learn from those mistakes? If you just take a big pencil eraser and erase all of it? Laura Ingraham has been really outspoken about this particular debate. She talked to us about it yesterday on Fox and Friends. Here she is last night with her thoughts on what she thinks should happen.
I understand that there's this newfound outrage and level of offense that it has reached this fever pitch about these statues. I mean, I think a lot of people have driven by these statues probably for decades and never thought twice about them, but now they've become a political symbol. And if it's a symbol that represents the racist past or any vestige of a racist past of the South, then they're going to be able to say, well, then that has to go too. I don't know how far they want to take it. Maybe they'll take it to certain books that they think are offensive or certain speakers on college campuses who are offensive. I think we have to ask the question, what next? How are we going to heal as a nation, condemn that which is evil, and then come together as a country?
There's the key. Coming together as a country is so vital at this point.
Well, I mentioned earlier, what about how many signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners? And somebody emailed me about a third of them were. So what happens to them and their historical record going forward? I also saw something online that talked about, what about all the places in West Virginia named after Robert Byrd, who was U.S. Senator for decades out there, who was in his 20s a recruiter for the KKK, and I think he eventually rose up to Grand Cyclops or something like that in his local chapter. What happens to all those buildings in West Virginia with his name on? That is the debate apparently we are about to have.
And it's a very, very good question. And the debate will continue, so more on that coming up.
In the meantime, coming up, the special election to fill Attorney General Jeff Sessions' Senate seat, now heading to a runoff between Luther Strange and challenger Roy Moore down in Alabama. President Trump is at Trump Tower right now, but a little later on today he's going to head back west to Bedminster this afternoon, about 50 miles from where we're sitting right now.
But first, protesters will be waiting to greet him when he leaves Trump Tower in New York City.
That's where we find David Lehman. David, what's the scene there?
Right now, things are very quiet. You might call this the morning after a very contentious news conference. But as of now, not a demonstrator in sight. The scene last night, though, was somewhat different. There were about 500 demonstrators out on the streets outside Trump Tower. The numbers kept down, possibly because of the bad weather. There was some heavy rain. There were about 500 anti-Trump protesters and a smaller number of pro-Trump protesters. 35-year-old man was arrested for punching a Trump supporter. He was charged with misdemeanor assault. Also, a 28-year-old woman was charged with disorderly conduct. Also on hand, the documentary filmmaker Michael Moore. After doing a live show on Broadway, he bussed in his audience members for a post-show protest. But as I reported moments ago, the crowds overall were significantly smaller than what we saw on Monday night. The president, he's already up at a few minutes after 6 o'clock this morning. In fact, he sent out a tweet. It said, quoting now, "Amazon is doing great damage to tax-paying retailers. Towns, cities, and states throughout the U.S. are being hurt. Many jobs are being lost." Now, Jeff Bezos is the CEO of Amazon. He is also the owner of the Washington Post, and that is a newspaper that President Trump has singled out for what he calls its unfair news coverage. The president also sent out another tweet this morning, guys, talking about Kim Jong-un and the situation in North Korea. He said that Kim Jong-un made a wise and reasoned decision. The alternative would have been catastrophic and unacceptable. Obviously addressing there the threat that was not followed up to fire missiles in the direction of Guam. And as you mentioned just a moment ago, we expect that the president is going to spend the next several hours here at Trump Tower, and then it's off to Bedminster, New Jersey, where he will resume there what is described as a working vacation. Back to you.
All right, David Lee Miller over on Fifth Avenue. We thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
So Trump Tower is the center of the Twitterverse this morning.
It is. No surprise there, though.
It's fascinating. The complete North Korea story lost in all the last 24 hours.
It's a huge one. It's a huge one.
It is indeed. Meanwhile, the special election down in Alabama to fill Attorney General Jeff Sessions' former Senate seat, heading to a runoff between Luther Strange and our next guest.
25 minutes after the hour. Back with some quick headlines. Texas bans taxpayer funding of abortion. Governor Greg Abbott tweeting this. New law signed to ensure no Texan is required to pay for a procedure that ends the life of an unborn child. The law applies to elective abortions through insurance plans and exempts medical emergencies to save the mother's life. Also this morning, a major drug company heading to court accused of profiting from the opioid crisis. South Carolina now suing Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, claiming that the company encouraged over-prescribing and didn't go far enough to warn about overdose dangers. Steve?
Part of his crackdown on sanctuary cities, Attorney General Jeff Sessions heading to Miami-Dade, Florida later today, highlighting that county's cooperation and the $500,000 in grants they will now receive.
Joining us now ahead of the Attorney General's remarks, Miami-Dade County Mayor Carlos Jimenez. Carlos, thank you so much for being here. Just give us a little bit of the history. You were a sanctuary, now not. Break that down for us.
That all started back in May of 2016 under the Obama administration. They labeled us a sanctuary city because we were not honoring detainer requests from the federal government. We made a change in policy in February where we are now honoring the detainer request, so we will hold somebody for 48 hours after their time is up in Miami-Dade County Jail, and if the ICE comes and picks them up, then they can pick them up. We always shared information with ICE. We've never considered ourselves a sanctuary city, so actually this has gone through 2 different administrations as we're trying to fight the sanctuary city label to make us eligible to receive federal funding, and so that's really basically what's transpired.
Well, you're fighting the sanctuary city label to get the money. Are you a sanctuary city?
No, we're not. We never considered ourselves a sanctuary city. We always gave the information to all police agencies. When anybody is arrested in Miami-Dade County, they get fingerprinted, they get photographed, they're ID'd, and then all that information is sent out throughout the country. We always did that. We just didn't honor the 48-hour detainer request. Now we are honoring the 48-hour detainer request, and so that's why General Sessions feels that we are no longer a sanctuary city.
Yeah, this is a top priority for the Attorney General. He's going to be traveling to Miami-Dade and speak about this directly. We actually got a bit of what he's going to say to the show. I want to read some of this to you. He says, I know that Miami-Dade will be an example of the good that comes from following the law. We have already seen that. The same Independence Day weekend when Chicago suffered more than 100 shootings and 15 homicides. Miami-Dade also had a historic number of shooting deaths, 0. That's just a bit of what you're going to hear later on from the Attorney General. How important will his comments be?
Well, they're very important. I mean, I think our policy is the right policy in terms of